The policy was clear, the reasons and consequences much less so, and it has proved mighty controversial. Rishi Sunak today explained why he was granting more than 100 new drilling licences for oil and gas in the North Sea.
What I'd say is entirely consistent with transitioning to net zero.
This is a catastrophic decision for the UK public and for our climate.
But we already export up to 80% of the oil that is currently extracted, and campaigners and critics lambasted Mr Sunak for putting climate change targets at risk. Also on News at 10 tonight. Mr Trump's Florida property manager appeared in court as the former president predicted again new charges against him are imminent. New figures given to us by Greenpeace show sewage was pumped into protected habitats for a scarcely believable 300,000 hours last year. Devastating new floods sweep through Beijing and what a finish. The series may technically have been a draw, but Stuart Broad bowed out of the Oval in style.
This is DanTV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. If the climate was not such a hot-button political issue, the announcement about billions more of carbon capture investment may perhaps have been left to a junior minister. Instead, the Prime Minister hot-footed it to Aberdeenshire to announce it himself. It also gave him the chance to try to explain why his government has agreed to more than 100 new oil and gas extraction licences. Mr Sunak sees no contradiction. The new licences are entirely consistent with reaching net zero, he said. And he clearly sees a policy division with Labour. He said he wants to max out on North Sea oil and gas because it is good for Britain's energy security. Although, if we're honest, up to 80% of the oil currently extracted goes overseas anyway, so the logic wasn't immediately obvious. Friends of the Earth said Mr Sunak was pouring fuel on the flames of climate change.
North Sea oil production is about to get bigger. At least 100 new licences will be granted for oil and gas exploration here, and that could include Rosebank. 80 miles west of Shetland, Rosebank is the UK's largest untapped oil field, and it's also home to an array of sea life. This is where people and planet come into collision. On a visit to Scotland today, the Prime Minister defended his announcement on oil expansion.
What I'd say is entirely consistent with transitioning to net zero, that we use the energy we've got here at home because we're going to need it for decades, so far better for our economy, for jobs and for climate emissions, so we get it from here rather than shipping it from halfway around the world.
It is an undisputable scientific fact that burning fossil fuels contributes to pollution that is warming the planet. But the Prime Minister had another announcement today, which he says could offset that. He's investing in technology that will capture these planet-warming emissions at places like this oil refinery and store them before they can get into the atmosphere. The technology is carbon capture, a three-step process. First, capture those planet-warming emissions using a solvent to keep it trapped. Then the polluting carbon dioxide is separated, in this case piped back out to the North Sea from where it originally came. In the final step, the carbon dioxide is to be injected deep underground into the seabed. The idea is it can be stored there safely and securely. Energy experts have been calling for more carbon capture like this in the UK. They say it will help deliver a fair transition to net zero emissions, preserving skilled work in the oil industry and creating new green jobs.
Carbon capture and storage is required for the world to get to net zero, but not all countries have the capacity to do it. Countries like us in Norway and the United States do. There's opportunities not only in preserving all of these jobs, but the jobs that are going to be associated with actually carrying out the carbon capture and storage. That'll help transition a lot of jobs in the oil and gas industry, and it could open up new export markets for us if other countries need their CO2 taken away.
But environmentalists don't believe the technology is capable of capturing emissions from so many new oil fields, and so economic opportunities will come at a price for the planet.
This is a catastrophic decision for the UK public and for our climate. We know that we can't have any new oil and gas fields if we're going to stay within safe climate limits, and we're seeing evidence of the climate crisis all around us.
There is now a clear line in the sand on environmental policy, with Labour openly against expanding North Sea oil. So would they withdraw these licences if in government?
We're committed to no new oil and gas licences, but for various reasons we would not be cancelling them. We would prefer it if the government didn't grant them. We think it's the wrong decision.
It is a crucial crossroads in the climate emergency, and the direction taken by the UK today will, one way or another, impact the lives of generations to come. Peter Smith, News at 10, Grangemouth.
If you are confused, you are not alone. So where do Mr Sunak's plans for North Sea energy leave our climate commitments? Well, in 2019, the UK became a world leader, the first major economy to legislate for net zero, the point where we produce no more greenhouse gases than we're able to remove from the atmosphere. The government committed to reach that target by 2050. Now, while the UK is a net importer of oil and gas, Friends of the Earth say that 80% of oil and 61% of gas extracted from the North Sea actually end up being exported and sold on the open market. Overall, though, the UK's greenhouse gas emissions have fallen 46% in the past 3 decades, mainly due to the rapid shift from coal to renewables. And the government has committed to fully decarbonising our power supplies by 2035. Renewable generation reached a record share of nearly 50% in the first quarter of this year. Well, what about cars? Fossil fuel vehicles have been on the way out in the UK since 2020, when Boris Johnson committed to banning the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030, which perhaps helps explain why in the UK 16% of new cars are electric. The government wants to reduce household emissions by banning gas boilers in new houses from 2025. Last year in the UK, just over 55,000 heat pumps were sold. Not so bad, you might say, but other countries have gone much, much further. In France, more than 10 times that number were installed, with 1 in every 20 French households doing so.
David Cameron urged people to vote blue, go green, posing with huskies in the Arctic to highlight the impact of climate change. Then Theresa May enshrined a net zero commitment into law, a policy Boris Johnson was quick to boast about. Today, Rishi Sunak flew by private jet to Aberdeen to announce hundreds of new gas and oil licences, a day after promising to review anti-car schemes.
Thank you very much.
It's a shift in tone that some in his party are welcoming.
We've just been hit by this huge wave of energy crisis, followed by food crisis, followed by a very high inflation rate and significant cost of living as a result. I think governments have to take consideration of that, not to deliver a kind of punishment beating on the way in to net zero.
For the former head of the Tory party, this was strong leadership from Sunak. For others, the opposite. In a statement, Tory MP Chris Skidmore, who carried out a review of net zero, said that this is the wrong decision at precisely the wrong time. It is on the wrong side of a future economy. It is on the wrong side of modern voters who will vote with their feet at the next general election. And it is on the wrong side of history.
Sadiq Khan has lost Labour this election in his...
Rishi Sunak appears to have toughened his position since winning the Uxbridge by-election, after opposing a clean air policy that will hit some motorists. Posing this weekend in Margaret Thatcher's Old Rover, he attacked Labour as anti-car and pro-Just Stop Oil. So how do the campaign group react to repeated government attacks?
Climate change isn't a political problem. This is about the survival of all of us. It's about our future. It's about people all over the world. And the Conservatives are turning this into a culture war, and it's deeply irresponsible.
A key independent advisor to government on net zero called on ministers to make a positive economic case for tackling climate change.
We've had effectively a vacuum on that.
And is that a shift from the previous Prime Minister?
I think you have to say it is a shift. I mean, I don't blame the Prime Minister directly for that, but it's a noticeable difference from government that we had 18 months ago, 2 years ago, that was talking about net zero in those terms. And that's the way the US talks about net zero now. Europe's thinking that way about it. It feels like the UK is not seeing what's happening around it, and that's a real problem, I think.
The Prime Minister insists that oil and gas will be needed for decades while we transition to net zero.
And Anishka is here to help explain all this. for a lot of people, or maybe I just mean for me, it's really confusing when he talks about this is really good for our energy security, and then when you dive into the detail, most of it goes to the open market, and we export 80% of our oil anyway. So what's the logic to that?
Well, I think there is a debate about how much this does for energy security. I was talking to one energy analyst, Seppi Golzari-Munro, a real expert in this area tonight, and she made exactly that point. Yes, this is our territory. Yes, we make money by issuing licences, but then ultimately the oil and gas belongs to the private companies and they can sell it to whoever they want. And as you say, a lot of it does not sell to the UK. Now, the government would say at least it's not being controlled by Russia, who can hold back supply and drive up prices. But she and others, you heard Chris Stark at the Climate Change Committee argue this a bit in my piece, say there are other ways to help energy security. You can invest in energy efficiency like insulation, or you can invest in renewables. They point to countries like the US spending literally hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money on green technology. Labour are actually looking to Joe Biden to see how they can frame this as more of a cost of living policy rather than green policy, if you like. But it is true that voters are really worried about the cost of all of this. Scarlett Maguire from JL Partners was talking to me today. That's a research company, saying it is true that if you ask people about climate policies that hit them in the pocket, then support falls. But also, overall, there is wide support for net zero. So the PM sees this as a political opportunity, but there is clearly, Tom, a big political risk for him as well.
OK, we'll see how it plays out for now. Thank you very much indeed. Well, while Donald Trump awaits charges over the storming of the Capitol in Washington, more than 2 years ago now, the property manager at his Florida estate appeared in court in one of the other cases Mr. Trump is involved in, the storage of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. Like those documents, the charges are stacking up. Dan is in Washington. Dan, every time we talk about this, there's at least a million questions I'd like to ask you, not least what happens if he gets convicted and then wins the presidency and is trying to run America from within prison. But let's not get distracted by that now. A big 2 weeks for him coming up, potentially.
Yeah, exactly. So today we've had this property manager, Carlos de Oliveira, appearing in court in Miami, unable to enter a plea because he hasn't got a lawyer registered in Florida. And that will be music to the ears of Team Trump that want this classified documents case delayed as long as possible. But it's not the only legal jeopardy that Donald Trump is facing. We understand that security is being tightened around the courthouse in Fulton County, Georgia, and that's where another big, long 2.5-year investigation is coming to a conclusion, all to do with election interference. You'll remember that infamous call in which Donald Trump made a call to an election official claiming he just needed 11,780 more votes. So that may come in this week, and we may see charges on that. And then there's another case involving January the 6th, based here in Washington by the Department of Justice Special Counsel Jack Smith as well. Here's the thing though, Tom, with all of this legal jeopardy, Donald Trump is riding high and remains high in the polls for the Republican nomination. He's currently 35 to 37 points ahead of Ron DeSantis, his nearest rival, who is falling in the polls. The money keeps pouring in for Donald Trump as well. So it seems like the worse the news is for Donald Trump, the better he does. And it's looking like we're heading towards a rematch of Biden-Trump as we saw in 2020. And at the moment there, the polls are evens.
Dan, say what you like. It is fascinating. For now, thank you very much. To be continued, one suspects, ad nauseam. Now, after years of personal trauma and months of legal limbo, it was perhaps understandable that former miner David Hunter was lost for words today. He'd just been told he was free to go by a court in Cyprus, where he'd been found guilty of killing his wife for 52 years, Janice. Struggling with the pain of blood cancer, she begged him to do it. Well, today he said he couldn't describe how he felt. He did, though, want to thank his family and former workmates back home in Ashington, in Northumberland, for their support.
David Hunter walks free. With tears in his eyes, the former miner from Northumberland stands with his legal team. A 19-month jail sentence now over.
How are you feeling, David?
I can't describe it. I'm sorry. I wish I could. I wish I could find words to describe it. I can't.
Thank you.
When you're under pressure for 2 years, wondering which way it's going to go, I would like to say thank you to all the people who've donated to me, and especially my mates, my workmates. I didn't know where I would be without them.
10 days ago, following a 10-month trial, David Hunter from Ashington was cleared of murdering his wife Janice, but found guilty of manslaughter. Mr. Hunter was married to his wife for more than 50 years. They'd moved to Cyprus in their retirement.
Who loves me? Hands up! Hands up!
He said he acted out of love and she'd begged him for weeks to end her pain from blood cancer. He suffocated her at their home in December 2021 before trying to take his own life. This case has not been heard by a jury, but by 3 judges. Their closing remarks were translated to David Hunter, who sat all in black in the dock. The judge said that this was not a typical case. He said before us is a unique case of a taking of life based on feelings of love. David Hunter was jailed for 2 years, but because of time already served and good behaviour, he has been set free.
We gave a long and difficult struggle, but we're very happy with the result, and I believe justice was served.
Back in Northumberland, former colleagues of Mr. Hunter waited for news. They've raised thousands of pounds for his legal fees. This has been a long journey.
It's like all my Christmases have come at once. It's everything that everybody here has been fighting for. We've been behind David from day one. I'm ecstatic. I can't even begin to think what he must be like.
David Hunter has also had the support of the couple's daughter, Leslie. She says she feels elated and stunned, and like her heart and family have been put back together. He's told friends he wants to stay in Cyprus, to be close to his wife, who's buried here. He says now he's been released, she can rest in peace. Katie Cole, News at 10, Paphos, Cyprus.
Back here now to one of our favourites, or perhaps that should be least favourite subjects here on News at 10. The sheer volume of sewage pumped into our waterways for reasons that are always hard to wrap your head around because it is so gross. If it is frankly awful anywhere, it seems just particularly bizarre when it comes to environmentally sensitive sites. And yet, according to Greenpeace figures given to us, sewage was poured into supposedly protected habitats on nearly 1,200 occasions last year and kept on pouring for a barely believable 300,000 hours.
The Lake District, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Some areas, like Esthwaite Water and Cunsey Beck, have even greater protection. Sites of special scientific interest, they should be a safe haven for nature.
Esthwaite Water, which is to our left-hand side, goes for about 2 miles all the way to Windermere Lake itself.
But there's something sinister below the surface. Untreated sewage was discharged into Cunsey Beck and Esthwaite Water for an average of 3.5 hours every day last year.
This is like really young.
This should be a protected wild sanctuary. This grass snake skin a clue to the rare species who live here. But life near the pipe is struggling.
Things that the grass snakes are eating, like the fish, the frogs, anything else, small birds. As soon as you start losing that lower level, which is what we're starting to see across the board with what our invertebrate surveys are showing, this will then impact these.
Overflow pipes are only supposed to be used in exceptional circumstances. But data given exclusively to ITV News by Unearthed, Greenpeace's investigative unit, shows there are nearly 1,200 different pipes discharging in or near precious conservation sites. Between them, they released untreated sewage for more than 300,000 hours last year. Outside Portsmouth, Langston Harbour is home to 20,000 migratory birds, 50 species of fish, rare European eels, and this pipe.
This pipe right here is where it all flows out of. When it comes out, it's absolutely astonishing.
This footage is from 2021. Last year, sewage was released into the harbour for 719 hours.
In this sewage and in this water is a chemical cocktail that our wildlife are swimming in all the time. We have the choice to stay out of that water after releases, but these creatures don't.
Marine biologist Alex Ford has been sampling the harbour for decades. He tests for chemicals and what impact they have on the local species.
So in these crabs we're finding a wide range of pharmaceuticals,
and illegal drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, MDMA.
He's discovered more than 50 different chemicals. Some may have come from farming, industry and boat paints, but many are human drugs, which have almost certainly come from sewage.
Those pharmaceuticals do very similar things to wildlife as they do to us. For example, the contraceptive pill will feminise a fish, an antidepressant will change the behaviour of wildlife.
The government says it will prosecute polluters. The body, which represents water companies, has apologised and pledged to invest $10 billion.
These overflows into sensitive areas will be among the earliest to get that money, bring and control those spills right down so that no environmental damage at all is being caused.
But it may take decades to land the prize of cleaner water. Martin Stew, ITV News.
Makes your blood boil, doesn't it? Anyway, as schools in England broke up for the summer, there seemed a good chance that teachers would carry on striking into the new school year. Now, they won't. Members of all four unions have decided to accept the 6.5% pay rise on offer from the government. The change of heart appears to be the result of an offer that money to pay for the rises wouldn't have to come out of existing school budgets. The effects of climate change, which we mentioned at the start of the programme, have already affected China badly this summer, as you've probably seen. Well, now Beijing has been hit by its worst floods for more than 10 years, brought about by its most powerful typhoon. For nearly 20, mass evacuations have kept casualties relatively low, but a second storm is now on the way.
In China's capital, many are desperately holding on to what they have. The worst flooding Beijing has seen in more than a decade has caused widespread devastation. Many precarious rescue missions are being carried out, but the persistent torrential rain has already resulted in casualties. Tens of thousands have been forced to flee their homes, while the advice for others is to stay indoors. We have transferred and resettled all the households in danger, says this local official, and persuaded the tourists to return home. Beijing has had a similar amount of rainfall in a couple of days that it would usually see in the whole of July. Typhoon Doksuri has meant a red alert being issued, the most severe warning level. It affects tens of millions of residents in several parts of China, including in Hebei province, close to Beijing. Thousands of emergency services workers are battling treacherous conditions. And unfortunately for them and so many others, the situation is likely to get worse before it gets better, with a new typhoon on the way over the coming days. Mark McQuillan, News at 10.
Back here now, and despite another wet week in the West Country, wild camping on Dartmoor has lost none of its appeal, especially not now that the High Court has decided that the public has, after all, the right to camp there without the landowner's permission.
They are celebrating their access to this natural world being restored and the right to roam. The fight for anyone to be able to pitch a tent wherever they want here again has been won.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's great news. Just to be out in the fresh air and to wake up in the morning and see a dawn on Dartmoor is really, really special. And to be told earlier this year that that wasn't our right anymore, to have that taken away was heart-wrenching.
For generations, they have admired the rugged, wild gloom of Dartmoor and its brooding beauty. The moor's wilderness was the only place in England where you could legally wild camp. That was until January.
What do we want? Wild camping!
When, despite opposition, a High Court judge ruled it was no longer allowed without the landowner's permission. Riled up by the ruling, thousands of people from across the country then braved winter on the moorland to defend their rights.
For 40 years, the law said that the public had a right of access to the common, both on foot and on horseback, for open-air recreation. So it was always assumed that meant a right to wild camp too. But the court said it wasn't the case and that local landowners had been suffering.
I have about 1,000 acres of...
John Howell's family has owned land here for 90 years and faced numerous problems with wild campers.
Groups of people who are having a binge, they make a mess, they leave litter, leave excrement, toilet paper, broken glass, all sorts of things. A disgusting mess, and it's been getting worse for about the last 20 years.
But Dartmoor National Park Authority appealed against those grievances, with success today.
We're delighted with the decision, but it'd be wrong to polarise this as national park versus landowners. It isn't. Actually, when you distill it down, we want the same thing. We want opportunities for people to enjoy the national park, but also to look after it.
There is a sense of absolute freedom in Dartmoor's emptiness and vastness. And now anyone who wants to come here has just that. Lucy Watson, News at 10, Dartmoor.
When the Lionesses kick off their third and final group stage match in the Women's World Cup tomorrow lunchtime, they only need a draw to reach the knockout rounds. Their manager, Serena Wiegman, will have to make changes again because of injury to Kira Walsh, but she told ITV Sport that wasn't a problem.
I think we have good players in that position, but we all know that Kira is exceptional in a couple of things, and that she has a lot of the ball. And I think we have those other players who can fill in that position. It will probably look a little different, but that's okay.
And you can watch how the Lionesses get on in their final group game right here tomorrow on ITV1. Coverage starts in the morning at 11:15. The most thrilling Ashes series for years ended this evening with bowler Stuart Broad writing yet another remarkable chapter in the history books of international cricket. With the last ball of his stellar cricketing career, he took the final Australian wicket to seal victory in the final test. It wasn't, of course, enough to win the series, but how everyone celebrated anyway. His teammates, the ecstatic Oval crowd, and his family in the stands.
Always the man for the big occasion, Stuart Broad did his best to make sure his last appearance in an England shirt was a special one. His family were all there at the Oval. His fans had come dressed in tribute headbands to watch him begin the English attempt to bowl the Australians out and draw level at the end of this magnificent Ashes series. But Australia, it seems, hadn't read the Stuart swan song script. Their batsmen made steady progress against him and the England total this morning. And then, of course, the weather intervened.
And here he is for one final time.
By the time the rain clouds had passed, it was well past tea time, and England had what light there was left this evening to get the job done. But it was Broad's colleagues who set about it. Moeen Ali got rid of Travis Head. Chris Wokes saw off Steve Smith. And as the Australian collapse continued, it was starting to look like the curtain might come down before Broad got in on the act. But if there's any limelight to be found, even this late in the day, he usually charges into it. So it was Stuart Broad who took the last 2 wickets of the day.
Would be to get straight down the ground.
To win the match and square the series.
I suppose when you make that decision to move on from the game, you sort of wonder what your last ball will be. So for it to be a wicket to win an Ashes Test match is pretty cool.
No other bowler has taken more wickets against Australia. He is an Ashes legend. Cheers, Broadie. And well played. Geraint Vincent, News at 10.
What a day, what a career. Now, finally, a sign that the summer silly season in the news cycle may be upon us. Claims that a bear in a Chinese zoo is actually a person in a costume have been lighting up social media all day. From this angle, you could be forgiven for thinking the sun bear looks, or at least stands, like a human. But a spokesperson for the zoo insisted that is just how sun bears stand, and anyway, it would be much too hot for a person to wear a bear suit in the heat of the summer. Yes, they really did put out that statement. So you see, it is now almost officially August when we'll all head to the beach. Or we would if it wasn't driving with rain, more or less every day. Very un-British to complain though, so I'm going to stop there and say good night and thank you very much for watching.